Britain built 3 of the most advanced bombers in the world, and in barely a generation, the whole idea behind them was already being torn apart. The Vickers Valiant, the Avro Vulcan, and the Handley Page Victor were brilliant machines built for a world that moved on faster than expected. At the end of the Second World War, Britain was a serious aviation power. British scientists had worked alongside the Americans on the Manhattan Project, but in 1946, the United States passed the Atomic Energy Act, which slammed the door shut on sharing nuclear secrets, even with allies who had helped build the bomb in the first place. Overnight, the country faced a choice: accept dependence on Washington or build its own bomb from scratch. Britain chose to build. But building the bomb was only half the problem. You also needed something to carry it, and nothing in the RAF's inventory came close. The frontline heavy bomber was the Avro Lincoln, propeller-driven with a top speed under 320 miles an hour and a ceiling of about 30,000 feet. So in 1947, the Ministry of Supply issued specification B35/46, calling for a medium-range bomber capable of cruising at 575 miles per hour up to 50,000 feet, delivering a 10,000-pound nuclear weapon to a target 1,500 nautical miles from base. For a country still clearing bomb rubble and rationing bread, it was an extraordinary demand. 3 companies were chosen. Vickers went conservative, a compound sweep wing built around well-understood aerodynamics that could be designed quickly. Their chief designer, George Edwards, promised the prototype would fly by the end of 1951, and production aircraft would follow by 1953 under budget. Avro went radical, a massive triangular delta wing, completely unproven in practical jet bomber form, drawing on captured German swept-wing research. Handley Page took a third path with the crescent wing, which decreased its sweep angle from root to tip and worked exceptionally well at transonic speeds. 3 types for one job sounds extravagant for a cash-strapped post-war Britain, but each design took a radically different approach to the same impossible problem, and the fear was that any one of them might fail. The Berlin blockade was looming. War with the Soviet Union seemed a genuine possibility. There was no time to design one aircraft, find out it didn't work, and start again. The gamble paid off. All 3 delivered. Vickers delivered first, and delivered spectacularly. The first Valiant prototype flew on the 18th of May, 1951, just 27 months after the contract was issued. All 107 production aircraft arrived on time and under budget. The Vulcan followed, first flying on the 30th of August 1952. That massive delta wing and unforgettable high-power howl grabbed the public imagination like nothing else in British aviation. The Victor completed the set on Christmas Eve 1952. Its crescent wing produced a remarkable effect during landing. In ground effect, it would flare naturally, producing a cushioned touchdown almost without pilot input. By the late 1950s, all 3 were in squadron service and performing at or beyond specification. The Vulcan was almost fighter-like for such a large aircraft, barrel rolls at air shows, maneuvers that were unthinkable for a bomber. The Victor could reach 627 miles per hour, climb past 56,000 feet, and had a range of about 5,200 nautical miles, exceeding the original specification by a wide margin. The V-bombers were regularly invited to American bombing competitions, and they consistently outperformed the B-52s in accuracy. The Valiant became central to Britain's nuclear program. On the 11th of October 1956, a Valiant of No. 49 Squadron dropped Britain's first air-delivered nuclear weapon over the Maralinga test range in South Australia. Then, on the 15th of May 1957, a Valiant dropped Britain's first hydrogen bomb during Operation Grapple over Malden Island in the Pacific. The Valiant is the only V-bomber that ever dropped a live nuclear weapon. The problem Britain had set out to solve, an independent nuclear deterrent, was solved, except the world had already moved on. In April 1957, Defense Minister Duncan Sandys published a defense white paper that sent shockwaves through the aviation industry. The paper argued that manned combat aircraft were approaching obsolescence and that guided missiles would take over most of their roles. It didn't kill the V-Force overnight. The bombers were already in production and there was nothing else ready to replace them. But it planted a flag Britain's own government was now openly saying that the age of the manned strategic bomber had a ceiling, and that ceiling was getting lower. But the V-bombers didn't need a white paper to tell them they were vulnerable. They already knew. Everything about the V-bombers rested on one assumption, that flying high and fast was enough. Get above the fighters, get above the flak, and the bomber gets through. For a few years, that held true. Then surface-to-air missiles entered the picture, and suddenly altitude was no longer a shield. It was becoming a trap. The clearest proof came in 1960, when Francis Gary Powers' American U-2 spy plane was shot down over the Soviet Union. The U-2 had been flying at an altitude that many had treated as close to untouchable. That sent a brutal message across the Western world. Altitude was no longer sanctuary. From 1960, an improved Vulcan B-2 entered service with more powerful engines, and from 1963, it carried the Blue Steel nuclear standoff missile. Instead of flying directly over a target, a Vulcan could now launch Blue Steel from up to 100 miles away while the missile surged towards its target at around Mach 3. Blue Steel kept the deterrent credible, but it was a stopgap, not a solution. The real long-term answer was supposed to be Skybolt, an American air-launched ballistic missile that would let V-bombers fire from hundreds of miles outside Soviet airspace, making the whole question of penetrating air defenses irrelevant. Britain signed an agreement with the United States in 1960 to acquire it, and the future of the V-Force was planned around it, but Skybolt ran into spiraling costs, repeated test failures, and growing doubts in Washington. In December 1962, the Americans cancelled it. The cancellation triggered a genuine diplomatic crisis. Britain had staked the credibility of its bomber-based deterrent on a missile that no longer existed. Prime Minister Harold Macmillan met President Kennedy at Nassau, and out of that meeting came the Nassau Agreement. Britain would get Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missiles instead. It was a fair deal in strategic terms, but it marked a turning point. The future of Britain's deterrent had just moved from the sky to the sea, and the decision had been forced not by Soviet air defenses alone, but by the collapse of the weapon that was supposed to keep the bombers relevant. But Polaris was still years from entering service. In the meantime, the V-bombers still had to get through, and once altitude was no longer safe, there was only one place left to go: down. V-bomber crews began training to fly at 250 to 500 feet, following the contours of the terrain at speeds around 350 knots, hidden from radar by hills and valleys. Squadrons that had trained to fly smooth, predictable profiles at the edge of the stratosphere were now practicing something closer to aggressive flying in aircraft the size of airliners. At high altitude, the air is thin and smooth. Down low, it is dense, turbulent, and unforgiving. Every gust, thermal, and ridge-generated wave hits the airframe like a hammer blow. A bomber designed to spend its life in the calm upper atmosphere was now being shaken apart by forces it was never stressed for. And the loads were not just rougher, they were relentless. Every sortie at low level did more cumulative structural damage than dozens of hours at altitude. And this is where the V-bomber story stops being one broad story and starts splitting into three very different ones. Because while all three bombers were forced into the same low-level world, they did not absorb that punishment equally, and the reasons came down to choices made on drawing boards a decade earlier. The Valiant broke first. George Edwards had designed it to be built quickly, and that speed came from a conventional stressed skin structure with relatively thin wing skins. At altitude, that was fine. At low level, the repeated flexing concentrated stress at the wing's rear spar. The fleet had already been kept in service beyond its originally planned fatigue life, so by the time the mission changed, the Valiant was absorbing punishment it had never been designed for, with margins that were already spent. By the early 1960s, fatigue cracks were spreading across the fleet. In August 1964, Valiant WP-217 suffered a rear spar failure during flight. Inspection revealed damage so severe that the wings were visibly drooping under their own weight. Fleet-wide checks found the same cracking everywhere. With repair costs spiraling, the government withdrew the entire fleet in January 1965 and scrapped the lot. The Victor cracked too, but for a different reason. Its crescent wing was aerodynamically brilliant, the most refined of the three, but that refinement came with complex internal structure and compound curves that made fatigue damage harder to find and harder to fix. Cracks could develop in areas almost impossible to inspect without tearing the wing apart. The RAF chose to convert the Victor into a tanker. At the time, it looked like a consolation prize. It turned out to be one of the smartest decisions in the whole story. The Vulcan, remarkably, coped. And the reason goes back to that massive delta wing. A delta distributes structural loads across a huge, deep wing route. There is no narrow spar carrying the full bending moment the way a conventional wing does. The forces from low-level turbulence were spread across a much larger area, and the thick root section gave the structure margin it was never designed to need. Crews found the Vulcan genuinely responsive at low level. It handled more like a large fighter than a bomber, with quick roll rates and positive control feel even in turbulence. Squadrons continued in the low-level penetration role into the early 1980s, but even the Vulcan couldn't escape the deeper problem. It had survived the physical punishment, but the mission itself had moved somewhere else. From 1968, the Royal Navy's Resolution-class submarines, armed with Polaris ballistic missiles, became the core of Britain's strategic nuclear deterrent. A submarine hiding deep in the ocean was harder to find, harder to stop, and far more credible as a guaranteed second strike weapon than any bomber flying thousands of miles through hostile airspace. On the 30th of June 1969, the V-Force formally handed over the strategic deterrent mission to Polaris. By 1993, the V-bombers had been withdrawn from service. 3 aircraft born from the same specification, each a different gamble on the future, each overtaken by it. The Valiant broke under stresses it was never designed to carry. The Victor found a second life as a tanker. The Vulcan held on the longest in its original role, but even it couldn't outrun a world that had moved the deterrent beneath the ocean. They didn't fail because they were bad aircraft. They failed because the mission they were built for ceased to exist. So that's it for today's video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. It goes a long way for us.